Picking up from where we left off, talking about what kinds of things do we remember well, or another way of thinking about that is how do we make sure that we remember something well? And we left off in the last one talking about the quality and quantity of attention and creating well-worn pathways and convincing your brain it's important. And I just want to pick up and kind of expand on that a little bit. Well-worn pathways, think about this as if you cut across the grass. If you cut across the grass a whole bunch of times today and we came back in a week, we wouldn't be able to tell where you cut across the grass. The grass would have recovered. There would not be a well-worn pathway. But if you cut across the grass a couple of times today and a couple of times tomorrow and a couple of times the next day, then by next week we probably would start seeing a well-worn pathway. And the same is true when you're trying to remember things. So many of you use repetition as a way of studying, where you look at the stuff over and over, and that is good in terms of quantity. But part of the quality of attention is not just how much time, but how long a period of time do you come back to it. So, for example, if you studied for 3 hours tonight for our exam, that is not as good quality as if you studied a half hour for each of the next 6 days. That if you study for a half hour for each of the next 6 days, you create a well-worn pathway. You come back to it, you come back to it. Essentially, you make that pattern of neurons fire over and over and over. But also, in terms of convincing your brain it's important, if I just see something today for a long time, my brain has no reason to believe that that's ever going to be useful again, or I'm ever going to need to know that again. Whereas if you see it today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day, sorry, I got interrupted. But so if I see that information every day for the next 6 days, then my brain says, you know what, if we saw it every day for the last 6 days, I bet that's going to come up again. I should hang on to this information. And that's what we mean by convincing your brain it's important. So I always tell a story here about kind of an odd experience that I had. So a bunch of years ago when my kids were in elementary school, I had a routine that was pretty set. And that routine was that I would drive them to school in the morning, drop them at their school, and then continue on my way to the college. And I left because school started at the same time every morning. I would drop them at the same time every morning, and then I would turn onto Mountain Road in Cheshire the same time every morning. And one morning I looked up, and coming the other direction on Mountain Road was a Subaru. And there was a man driving the Subaru. And to be honest, the first time I paid attention to him, because he was kind of an unusual looking man, he was kind of odd looking. And I thought, an odd looking person, or whatever I thought. But the next morning I saw him again. And the next morning I saw him again. And then again and again and again. And I noticed him every day. And, think about two cars passing. Saw each other for maybe a second. He clearly was on the same schedule I was on. But for a period of about 6 or 7 years, most mornings, I would pass this man and think, there's that guy again in the Subaru, right? There's a Subaru guy. And then I stopped dropping my kids at school, right? But it's a second a day, 4 days a week, 4 seconds a week, 16 seconds a month, 10 months a year, 160 seconds, right? So a couple minutes a year that I saw this man, but over and over and over. And then about 5 years ago, so a lot of years had passed, I was on my driveway walking the dogs, and so I wasn't on Mountain Road. And I look up, and there's a Subaru, a different Subaru, coming towards me. And I look up, and it's the guy. It's the guy. He's older, a little grayer. I'm sure I'm older too. But it was the same guy. And I want to think about that for a second. So I saw him like 2 minutes a year for 5 years. I'm like 10 minutes total in my life, maybe. But I recognized him immediately, that I had created a well-worn pathway that recognized his face. My brain had decided his face must be important because I'd seen him every day for so long. If I had stood in line with that man 10 years ago for 10 minutes, I probably wouldn't recognize him now. If I'd sat next to him at a play or a sporting event, right? Unless he'd done something to make him seem important, I wouldn't have remembered him. But if I see him every day for a long time, my brain says, we're going to hang on to that. He must be important. And I want you to think about that in terms of your studying, right? Because most of you study just by repetition. which is not a bad starting point. So you use flashcards, you read your textbook, you read your notes over and over, maybe you watch this over and over. But if you only do that in a single night, or you only do that, over the course of 2 days, your brain's saying, I don't know, convince me. Maybe this isn't important. Maybe we'll never need this again. Um, and then you don't remember it, right? Or you don't remember it well anyway. And so coming back to it, and I don't know if you remember thinking about spaced studying back when we were talking about research. We were looking at some articles for you guys to think about how research was constructed. But this is why spaced studying is so important. You study a little bit today, and a little bit tomorrow, and a little bit the next day, etc. The other thing you should do while you're studying is that you should try to connect the information you're learning, the new information, to information you already know well, essentially to make it piggyback on what is already well-worn or well-established pathways. So if you can make it self-referential, that's great, right? So I give you examples from my personal life. I hope that you also think about similar examples from your life, because that is information you will automatically remember well. The other thing you guys can do to try to store information well is to use mnemonics. So the example I give in the slide is Roy G. Biv, but many of you might remember Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally, which is the order of operations in a mathematical equation. And that's also easier, right? It's a little easy tidbit, essentially, for you to remember. Right. And so when we talk about storage, one of the things to think about is if you're creating neural pathways and your hippocampus is going to say, hey, does anybody have any information on this? Part of what you want to do is create storage, create neural pathways, neural patterns in as many parts of your brain as possible. If you just read, for example, then just your visual cortex, your occipital lobe, has that information. But if you read it loud to yourself, then your auditory cortex and your visual cortex have that information. And when your hippocampus says, does anybody have information about this? You've got two areas of your brain that are metaphorically raising their hands to tell you. As many parts of the cerebral cortex as you can use. If you can think deeply about things, if you can challenge yourself to explain concepts to other people, if you make yourself think hard about the material, you're using more neurons, and those neurons can play back what they know, right? They can play back what they were doing when they were taking in the information. So if you're looking at flashcards and you're just looking at them and flipping them and looking at them and flipping them, that's not as good as having somebody else hold your flashcards and having them challenge you to explain to them, right? I think I told you at the beginning of the semester, find somebody who loves you enough who will let you teach them psychology. If you teach somebody, you have to use a whole lot of your brain to do that, and therefore you have a whole lot of your brain, a whole lot of neural pathways that can give you that information back. Let me back up here just a little bit. The other thing that we mentioned earlier, but that I want to make sure you pay attention to, is the role of emotion. That adrenaline and any emotion I could evoke, right, in you is going to make you remember things better. So hopefully the times I made you laugh in class, the times that I made you, feel something, the times I tell you personal stories maybe that make you feel something, those are things you might remember better. And if you want to pause here, you can, and go watch that video on emotion and memory, or finish out this video and then watch that. But it talks about emotion in great detail. So let's talk briefly about retrieval. Retrieval is the same as opening a file on your computer, and really retrieval just is going to be only as good as the storage that you had. And so the hippocampus we've already mentioned is our directory. Let me move this. Is our directory, and it keeps track of where memories are stored, right? And so the more places you've stored it, the easier retrieval will be. When we say we have forgotten something, typically what forgetting means is that you have misplaced it. Often when you forget something while you're taking an exam, you'll find that as you're walking to your next class or doing something later on that day, that you find that information, right? Suddenly there, not in a timely way, but it was stored, but not stored well enough for you to get it quickly. And so often forgetting is about that. Forgetting can be about the idea that you never stored it as well, that you came across it, but you actually never stored it. And that can happen also. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. We also, you can think about two different kinds of experiences that might help retrieval. We have context-dependent memory, which means that it's easier to retrieve things in the same place or physical location, same environment where they were stored. So if you've been studying for psychology sitting in your bedroom, then probably you're going to do best on the test if you also take it in your bedroom. State-dependent memory is more about retrieval being easier if you're in the same physical state. And here's my suggestion for this. Find a flavor of candy that you don't normally eat, butterscotch or something. While you're studying psychology, suck on that flavor candy. Create a physical state. And then when you take the test, suck on that candy. You'll find that will wind up just being an association to the things you remembered, and it will make retrieving the information just a little bit easier. The other thing we have in terms of retrieval is the difference between recognition and recall. Recognition is just being able to recognize or find information after you've been given clues. Recall is being able to retrieve information in the absence of clues, and it's harder. It's why you guys don't like open-ended questions as much as you like multiple choice questions. So the next video we'll talk about stages of memory, but we're going to stop here and come back to that.